Thank you, Millie, and thank you, Miriam, and thanks to everyone for coming. It's really fantastic to see so many people here, so many people interested in this church, I hope, and its early history. It is a fantastic building. I moved into this region about 11 years ago when I got a job at the University of East Anglia, and this was one of the first places I identified to go see as soon as I could. And I've been coming here for a few years since, just to visit when I can, and it's such an amazing example of early nonconformist church architecture, but also a really, really unique one in its setting and in the prehistory of this building. So hopefully I will try my best to excite you guys about the early history of the church that went on to form this chapel. And that's an important point, because what I'm going to be talking about is the early years of that church, which eventually would procure this building after the Act of Toleration in 1689 and turn it into this amazing nonconformist chapel. But I'm going to be talking about the church before it came to this building. I'm going to be talking about its origins, really, in the mid-17th century British Revolution. So that period from the Civil Wars through the interregnum, when Oliver Cromwell largely reigned over the British Isles. I'm going to be talking about it from the beginning of that church, just a few months after the regicide of Charles I, up to the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660. So a really interesting kind of decade plus for this church. And this is a period when you may know, but if you don't, hopefully this will be useful. This is a period when England and indeed Britain and Ireland were transformed into a republic, first under the Rump Parliament that had put Charles I on trial and executed him, and then after that under a series of regimes, most notably the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. And throughout that whole period, all of these regimes fostered and protected theological and ecclesiological creativity for 10, 12 years. And it's really that sort of decade plus of relative religious toleration that allowed the four great denominational churches, commonly known as Old Descent in this country: Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, Quakers, that Old Descent. That's the decade in which these great denominations established themselves. They did that during this period of relative toleration. The original Walpole congregation was a congregational church, and it played a small, but I hope to show not insignificant role in this larger story of the emergence of the birth, really, of Protestant descent in Great Britain. So the church first gathered on the 21st of June, 1649. That's a Thursday. It was 5 months after the execution of Charles I. And what I want to do is try to put those first 10 years in context. And I really don't have any other choice, because we have very few sources that survive that tell us any information about this congregation in its early years. The church's early records, if in fact they kept any, do not survive. Lots of records for this area don't survive. The parish registers for Walpole, for instance, are lost for the 17th century. There are no diaries or letters that we know of for early ministers or significant members of the congregation, certainly not that I don't know of, certainly any that I know of. So what we have are only really a few hints about this church that emerge in other sources, which I will explain. And so what I'm going to try to do is take these little nuggets of information that emerge in a few other sources and try to make the most of them by setting them in context, setting them within the broader history of the Congregational movement and indeed the British Revolution throughout this decade. So that's my task. You'll have a handout, hopefully. I didn't print off nearly enough. It's great to see something, so hopefully you can share. If not, you don't need it. It's just, I'm going to be talking about a number of names, mostly ministers, which I'll explain. So I just wanted to give you little bios of them, just so if you get forget who I'm talking about, you can look at your handout and remind yourself. Right. So to begin this process of contextualization, we can begin to think about the timing of when this church first gathered. While a few congregational churches had existed in England before June 1649, the reign of the Rump Parliament really ushered in the most active period of church gathering seen during the entirety of the British Revolution. We know that about probably 47 congregational churches had been gathered together during the Civil War period. There were a few of those quite well-known ones that emerged early on here in East Anglia, in Colchester, Norwich, and Great Yarmouth. And these were formed through a group of Puritan exiles who, in the 1630s, under religious persecution, had fled to the Netherlands, in particular to Rotterdam. Lots of people went to New England, but some went to Rotterdam, and it's those exiles that came back at the start of the English Civil War to, as they claimed, further the light that they now saw by gathering churches in their native country, in the places that they used to live. But this real growth, as I've said, of the congregational movement came later. It came after the regicide. And between the execution of Charles in January of 1649 and the end of 1643, about 73, or at least 73 congregational churches gathered throughout England. Another 12, we think, appeared in Scotland and Ireland. And the majority of the churches found here in East Anglia also gathered together in these 4 years, just like the Walpole congregation did. And we see a similar pattern with other church movements as well. So, for instance, the Baptist movement, while there were a few Baptist churches, quite famously in the 1640s, the real growth of the movement in terms of number of churches took place in that 4-year period from 1649 to 53. So why are so many new churches gathering during this period? Well, the Rump Parliament made no explicit statement about the legality of gathering churches separate from the parish. Rather, they implicitly acknowledged religious toleration. And they did this through a number of ways. They quietly dismantled legal restrictions on attending parish worship on Sunday. They also voted against confirming a national Presbyterian religious settlement that had been legislated throughout the 1640s. And if you don't know the period, episcopacy, which had governed the Church of England prior to the Civil Wars, was abolished very quickly by the Long Parliament in 1641. They set up a Westminster Assembly of Divines to create a new settlement for the church, which decided on a Presbyterian system, but that was deemed to be unfavorable to too many of Parliament's key supporters in the middle of a war. So in a sense, they never supported it. And the Rump Parliament failed to confirm it. They voted on it, and the vote didn't pass. So they neither took it off the books nor confirmed it, and it left it in this sort of limbo. And the result was that many people, in the words of one group of parish ministers from Gloucestershire, stopped waiting at this point on a legal reformation from Parliament and recognized the, quote, great mercy that we have in the protection from the magistrate in the peaceable practice of our consciences. What they're saying there is that they are recognizing that the government is allowing local groups, local parishes, anyone to, in a sense, form their own reformation and thereby form their own churches if they so wished. Now, despite being part of a trend of church gathering under these circumstances, the Walpole gathering does have a few oddities that are unusual. I've come to discover in preparing this paper, which I overlooked before, which has been great. Most congregational churches took one or two forms. Some, like the church just up the road towards the coast in Wrentham, 10 miles from here, were what we might call parish congregational churches. The parish minister there, a guy named John Phillip, had originally gained the living of Wrentham in 1609. He'd been persecuted and actually excommunicated for his Puritanism in the 1630s. He immigrated to New England, where he first practiced the congregational way, as it was called in New England. And then he returned at the outbreak of the Civil Wars to reclaim his living at Wrentham. And in 1650, he reformed the Wrentham Parish Church into a congregational model. So the church acted as a new type of parish worship where on Sundays the basic forms of worship were open to all, as they normally would have been, but only the godly, the members of his church, were allowed to the sacraments. And I'll say more about how that works in a bit. But that idea of reforming the parish was one model in which many of these congregational churches existed. The other common model is like the church that emerged in Bury St. Edmunds, the other way from here. And this was a gathering of basically local lay Puritans, completely separate from any parish setting. And they joined together for what they saw as a more pure form of worship. So these could often be more intense, and indeed the Bury Church was. In August of 1646, so right at the end of the First Civil War, 14 lay men and women from Bury St. Edmunds built a house for the Lord, as they called it, that was distinctly separatist. At their gathering, they promised, quote, not to return to the vain inventions of the Church of England, their human devices, their abominable idolatries, or superstitious high places. Very separatist. And also clearly very intense. And so that church seems to have burnt out. And 2 years later, some of these members gathered a second church, which we have record of. And this time, they invited some local congregational ministers from the region who did have parish livings, who worshipped in parish churches, to join them at their gathering, to extend the right hand of fellowship. And eventually, a few years later, they would gain a university-trained minister, although interestingly, they never would worship in a parish setting. Walpole conformed to neither of these models. First, it's probably worth saying that the church may not have even gathered in Walpole per se originally. The first record of the church can be found in the church book of the Great Yarmouth Congregational Church, which you can see in the Norfolk Record Office. And in April, so a few months before this gathering, April 1649, we are told in that church book, messengers came to Yarmouth from Cookley, that's the parish adjoining Walpole to the northwest. They came to inquire about embodying a church. And while we don't know the nature of the debate that took place when these messengers arrived in Yarmouth, two conclusions were reached. First, that 6 or 7 might embody, although upon the Lord's Day they could not always meet together. So we're looking at a very small group here, 6 or 7 people, and who can't always meet together. Second result was that 4 or 5 might and ought to keep up the Lord's Day's meetings once in the day at least, so once every Sunday, and meet on weekdays together when occasions serve for discipline and other church affairs, and that such as were able ought to exercise and keep up the church meetings. So again, they're concerned about the possibility of these 6 or 7 people being able to actually join together properly for worship and fellowship on a Sunday. 2 months later, the Yarmouth Church received a letter indicating that on the 21st of June, the saints in and about Cookley did intend to set down in gospel order. And they asked for their prayers for this great undertaking and also for the right hand of fellowship, which was duly granted after they traveled down there for the event. This letter was signed by 6 men, 4 of which were or would soon be parish ministers, all of which were university educated. These are all on your handouts. Samuel Manning was the first listed. He was, at least by the following year, the rector of Cookley and Walpole parishes. So those 2 parishes had been joined together. We have a source that says they were reduced to 1 cure by consent of the inhabitants. So the tithes to pay for the ministry weren't very much. So a lot of these smaller parishes would be joined together after 1650, and this is one of them. Listed next was his brother, John Manning, who was vicar of Sipton and Peasenhall from 1651 at least, the 2 parishes just to the south of here, that were also joined together in the midst of our period. John Tillinghast was the oldest listed on the group. He had been a minister in Sussex in the 1630s, came from that area. but appears to have settled in Salem about 13 miles to our west by 1650, if not a little bit before. And the fourth minister is perhaps being a little bit lenient calling him a minister, is a guy named Thomas Spratchett. He was a bailiff twice of Dunwich. He was also a registrar in Dunwich. He was clearly a lay preacher, but he must have been affected by it because he somehow managed to gain the curacy of Dunwich in 1653. I've not been able to locate any information on the other two men. They don't seem to be ministers. We have pretty good information about who the ministers are throughout England at this point. They're not listed. One of them was the other two signers of the letter were a guy named Robert Lugman and James Plow. So maybe one day I'll find out more about them, or maybe some of you know. But by late 1650, so just a year on from the gathering, we know that another local minister, a guy named Samuel Harbingham, who was rector of Hinningham, I think I'm saying this right. Huh?
Hebingham?
Well, I was told it was pronounced it's certainly spelled Hebingham, but I'm always, as an American, nervous. Anyway, I'll say Hinningham just for the fun of it, but it's spelled Hebingham. Samuel Harbingham was rector of Hinningham, 3 miles southwest of here. He had joined in with this church, if not at the beginning, then within a year. So by September of 1650, the Yarmouth Church Book is describing all of these men as part of the church at Walpole. So the gathering at Cookley, the church at Walpole, but the parishes had been joined under one of the ministers involved. So I think that's what we're seeing here with these name changes. At the foundation of the Walpole Church, then, we have 4 parish ministers from the area, and 3 laymen, one of which would soon take up a curacy. The concerned voice in that first entry in the Yarmouth Church Book, then, I think, about them being able to gather properly on Sunday for worship clearly stems from the slightly disparate nature of this group, having being ministers in the surrounding villages, and also the fact that the majority of them would have also been overseeing Sunday worship in the respective parishes as the cure required them. So joining together as one group on a Sunday was a challenge, and that's what they had originally sought advice on from the Yarmouth Church. How long the situation continued is unclear. In October of 1650, the Yarmouth Church called Harbingham to be their teacher, so it's kind of like an assistant minister to their main pastor. And over the next 3 months, the Yarmouth Church received letters and messengers from a whole range of people, listed occasionally as the church at Walpole, and also from the saints at Salem and Wingfield, who we are told in the midst of this catalog of discussion, we are told had recently gathered together under the ministry of John Tillinghast, so one of our founders. Clearly he had started a separate church in his own parish of Salem. So a second church is formed. All these correspondences pleaded that many people in this area had been converted by Harbingham's ministry in Hinningham, and that he also had received a call to the church at Salem, which Tillinghast was overseeing. So a compromise seems to have been reached, where Tillinghast took up the office of teacher in Great Yarmouth, and Harbingham transferred his parish living to Salem with Wingfield, clearly to oversee the very new congregational church that had just gathered there. This compromise also did not last. In June the next year, 1651, Harbingham came to Yarmouth to report that Tillinghast had received an invitation to the livings of Fresingfield and Oakley, not far from here, really either side of Salem. You can see there's like a whole group of people in these parishes that really want the ministry of these two men. By January, the list of people seeking Tillinghast services has expanded. The Yarmouth Church received messengers from the church in Salem, messengers from Oakley again, and also messengers from Trunch, a town in Norfolk in the northeast of Norfolk towards the coast. Neither of these latter two were listed as messengers from a church, so I think they're probably just groups of Puritans in the area that are seeking the ministry of Tillinghast. And after deliberation, Tillinghast decided to take up the rectorship at Trunch in Norfolk, and it's from that point on that we hear nothing more of this particular group of churches down here in mid-Suffolk from the Yarmouth Church Book. So that source runs dry, and that's what we have for the Yarmouth Church Book at least. Now, admittedly, these machinations over where ministers might settle are possibly tedious, or at least they definitely seem to prioritize the lives of male ministerial classes over no doubt the men and women who made up the congregations that I'm trying to get at here. But they're all we have, and I think if nothing else, we can at least say that the desire to have these congregational ministers among these in these parish livings, preaching amongst these lay people throughout this region of Suffolk and elsewhere, speak to a desire for a particular type of worship and churchmanship. They give us clues, I think, about where these sorts of people lived and what they wanted, and they hinted strongly, I think, that a significant body of Puritans lived throughout this mid-Suffolk region and were deeply attached to the ministry of Tillinghast and Harbergham, if not indeed to the idea of Congregationalism, young though it was for that period. Most of these messengers calling on Harbergham or Tillinghast to their towns and villages must have been lay people, for these parishes didn't have settled ministers in their cure. And we find similar debates over other livings throughout both the Great Yarmouth and the Norwich Congregational Church books over where ministers were settled and what will be most beneficial to spreading the gospel, at least, but one wonders the congregational gospel in particular. So while we rarely have names, characters, or backgrounds for any of these lay people, we can at least say that they were mobilized. They seemed determined and clear about the sort of minister and church that they wanted. We also see, with all this evidence, I think, the ease with which local Puritan groups could combine a parish living, their local parish living, with their desired type of churchmanship. It is improbable, I would, very improbable, and we have evidence to the contrary, that all the parishioners, for instance, in Cookley and Walpole would have been sympathetic to the ministers we've been talking about, let alone the congregational way. Rather, what we're probably looking at here is a subset of Puritans from this area who somehow managed to secure the minister of their persuasion, and no doubt they're doing that through links. We can show this in other settings, just not this one, through links with the government, through their parliamentary support over the 1640s, that sort of thing. We might think of the original Walpole Church, full as it was of local parish ministers, as a sort of starter church for Congregationalism in this area of Suffolk. Within a few years, we can trace settled congregational churches can be found in the parishes that were overseen by these ministers. And Puritans from other villages in the area were seeking out their own congregational minister. So the Walpole gathering really, I think, had given shape to a larger congregational movement here in mid-Suffolk. Well, what did this revolutionary congregationalism look like? Again, we have no direct evidence for what sorts of worship was practiced here in the early Walpole Church. But we know a lot about early congregational practices more generally, and in East Anglia here in particular, including some churches very nearby here. Congregationalists were, of course, as I said, one of the major denominational groups to emerge from the British Civil Wars and interregnum. And you may know it as well from its sort of pre-Civil War history as the church structure that became predominant in colonial New England, and more interested scholars may have already come across some of the Puritan exiles who went over to Holland. Congregational churches were, for this period at least, were covenanted bodies of visible saints, as they would say, professing Orthodox, Calvinist, or Reformed doctrine on the whole, and where religious authority was very much meted out through the congregation itself, the local congregation. That means they were democratic, so all male, at least, members of these churches debated on all aspects of practice and discipline, from when to hold communion, what sort of psalms to sing. Also, they would vote and participate in all forms of discipline, so whether or not someone might be excommunicated for some heinous sin. Membership in these churches was restricted to what they called the visible saints. So these are those who could, in practice, at joining the church, give an Orthodox Calvinist profession of faith, provide evidence that they were aware of and repented of sins in their life, and that they had a godly conversation, as they called it, which meant that their reputation within the community was such that they seemed to be godly. They weren't misbehaving regularly. There were no sort of scandals hanging over them, that sort of thing. Good behavior. All of this stuff was evaluated by the whole church at your admission into the church. Now, for some churches, this sort of process may also have meant that they required a sort of narrative of a conversion experience before a member might be admitted. But I think only some of the more radical churches did that, although there were some of those in this area. Membership, once you got it, entitled you to access to the sacraments, and in this setting there were two sacraments, communion and baptism, and it also entitled you to have a voice in the governance of the church, as I just said. Now, by design, this whole congregational structure was a much more kind of concentrated, close-knit style of worship and fellowship. Its name, Congregationalism, looking inward at the congregation, sort of captures the thrust of the church polity. And inevitably, perhaps, it tended to attract those who prized intense spiritual fellowship, engagement with other like-minded people, sharing spiritual experiences, and it also prized separation of the godly from the profane. So it's a distinctly Puritan church style that really only emerges from English Puritanism, because those are the sorts of values that were at the heart of English Puritanism from the Elizabethan period on up. Well, the Walpole congregation may have written its own confession of faith at its gathering. A guy named Thomas Harmer, who's he's actually a minister of the Congregational Church in Waddesfield in the 18th century. He also wrote a history of the Congregational churches in Suffolk. And in there, he claims to have seen what must be now a lost manuscript of the Walpole Confession of Faith written down at that gathering on the 21st of June, 1649, but it doesn't survive. We do know that writing these sorts of confessions of faith is common amongst these churches. A few of them survive for this area. The Wrentham Church has a very impressive one. The Bury St. Edmund's Church also has a lengthy one, an unusually lengthy one. The church certainly would have had a covenant. This was the constitution of the church, and all members had to sign up to the covenant at joining the church. Sometimes they would literally sign their name or put their mark. Other times it was a verbal statement, but there was always a church covenant in a congregational church. And by signing up to the covenant, new members typically promise to worship God according to His Word, so to be guided by the Bible entirely. They would promise to submit themselves to Christian discipline, which involved also statements about what they often term as mutual watchfulness or mutual watch. So that is, members were bound to watch over their fellow church members, their brethren and sisters in Christ, lovingly reproving them of any sin that they might fall into. This practice tends to have fallen by the wayside over the centuries, you might imagine. But it was really important to these churches at this time. It was a key part of the Calvinist doctrine of sanctification and assurance. Recognizing that all had sinned, as Calvinists did, and seeing repentance from sin as a key indication that the Spirit of God was in you, they focused a lot on sin and repentance as indications of your saintlyhood. That idea, again, that idea of visible saints, that idea that you might be one of the elect. Of course, in a Calvinist doctrine, no one can know ultimately whether they are actually of the elect, but they were desperate to know, and they had lots of theological formulations to help this out. And thinking about sin and repentance was key to that. So they assisted each other through this mutual watchfulness. Now, it's not hard to imagine how a church like this, when overseen by a local beneficed minister, could disrupt traditional practices within the parish. Most of the basic elements of Sunday worship would have remained more or less familiar, although they would not have gone anywhere near the prayer book. So a congregational minister like Samuel Manning, who officiated here in Walpole, would have continued to preach. Well, we know that. The word would have been read on Sunday. We know that from loads of evidence. They would have sang psalms, probably metric psalms with no accompanying instruments, but they would have definitely sung psalms in some format. And all of this would have been done openly to anyone who wanted to come in, so to the parish in general, or indeed anyone who wanted to come into the parish. It's really access to the sacraments that was restricted to these full church members who went through this admission process. Only members took communion, and some of these churches, like the church in Beckles, would often administer communion in a private house. They were small enough, their congregation, so they wouldn't do that publicly. Some people did do it publicly. It varied. And baptism for children was also restricted. So you could only have your child baptized if one of the parents, at least, was a member of the church. Not otherwise. So if you were living in Walpole when Samuel Manning was here and you had a child and you weren't a member of his church, your child would not be baptized, at least by him. So the Walpole parish registers, as I mentioned at my start, don't survive for the 17th century, but many of the registers for the neighboring parishes do, and we can see the impact of congregational ministry in some of those. So just to use one that I've already mentioned, at Sibton and Peasinghall, so this is where John Manning, Samuel's brother, was minister. Baptism registers for the 1650s, if you go look at them in Ipswich, are completely jumbled, with entries ranging from the 1640s up to the start of the 1660s, all mixed together in a non-chronological fashion, often with multiple children from the same family being listed in succession. And this is common for parishes overseen by congregational ministers, and I've done a lot of work on this in other settings, mostly in Norfolk, but the paleographic evidence for these types of parish registers indicates that most of these baptismal entries, marriage entries, and death entries, but particularly the Baptist ones are the ones they care about, most of these entries are actually compiled by the Restoration vicar in the 1660s. So they, in a sense, go door to door around the parish. Did you have any children born in the last 2 decades? What are their names? When were they born? Were they baptized? And then they go back and they record that into the registers, although proportionally not enough. So I think it must be just particular types of people in the parish who go out of their way to have this happen. Whatever the case, I think it seems probable that many local inhabitants begrudgingly lost access to the sacraments under the ministry of Samuel Manning when he was officiating here in the 1650s. And they would, at the same time, see their Puritan neighbors who were members of this church having access to those things. And we know from the Restoration that created lots of bitterness. Well, the last major set of clues we have about the Walpole congregation during the Revolution comes again from this group of ministers who first gathered the church here. Tillinghast, the two Manning brothers, and Harbergham all became involved in what became known as the Fifth Monarchy movement. So if you know your Bible, the book of Daniel prophesies that 4 successive world empires will precede a fifth and final kingdom of God, wherein Christ will reign as king. And many Puritans in the midst of this revolution saw the execution of Charles I as a providential judgment not just on Charles, but on the institution of monarchy in general. For some, this regicide promised to usher in the destruction of all worldly monarchy, representing the end of that Fourth Empire and thereby clearing the way for the physical return of Christ and the Fifth and Final Empire. Now, Daniel's 4 monarchies had been interpreted by scholars well back into the medieval period, but driven by this context of regicide and revolution, what made these Fifth Monarchy men of the 1650s so unique and dangerous is that they began to argue that England should be governed by a body of saints, as they called it, who would prepare the way for the imminent coming of Christ. The first statement about this sort of idea, this Fifth Monarchism, came from an anonymous printed petition from, as it termed themselves, the Saints in Norfolk and Norwich. It was printed in London just 1 month after the regicide, so almost immediately, and it questioned, quote, whether there is not a kingdom and dominion of the church or of Christ and the saints to be expected on earth. Whether this kingdom be not external and visible in the world, so real rather than just spiritual. And whether the powers of this world, whether kings, parliaments, or magistrates, should not be put down in place of multiple gathered churches ruling together in general assemblies and church parliaments made up of messengers from the gathered churches. Now, these ideas split the gathered church movements of the Revolution. They split the Congregational movement and the Baptist movement in particular, right across the British Isles, with some members of these churches calling for this new representative body to govern the nation through the gathered churches, really, and other members of these groups calling for restraint, calling for obedience to the powers that be. This was the midst of the Puritan Revolution, after all, when Puritans had taken over the government. And they argued that many godly people were also not members of the gathered churches. They might be Presbyterian or worshiping even in one of the prayer book churches. One of the key forums for this whole debate over Fifth Monarchy, outside of London anyway, was East Anglia, where this first statement of Fifth Monarchism had indeed emerged. And the most sophisticated, systematic, and respected theologian of this revolutionary Fifth Monarchy movement was John Tillinghast, vicar of Salem until he moved to Norfolk. He had a number of major publications on biblical prophecies. His generation work, which was his first statement, came in 1653. It was a sermon that he had given before the Radical Barebones Parliament. This first idea of a Parliament of Saints was at least partly tested in Barebones. Tillinghast gave a sermon before them and published it. The following year, he published a book called Knowledge of the Times, and 2 more parts of his generation work. And here what he's doing in these work is he's historicizing not only the prophecies in Daniel, but other biblical prophecies, such as the 7 vials of the book of Revelation in chapter 16. So he systematically goes through the vials, outlining their historical context, and inevitably, of course, predicting when the end times were going to happen. Now, interestingly, the third part of his generation work was dedicated to Oliver Cromwell, then Lord Protector. But by 1655, his sermons had taken on a critical tone, arguing that, quote, a key sign of the end times was the defection and apostasy of eminent leading men in the churches from their first light and principles. That's aiming not only at Cromwell, it's a very common accusation of Cromwell since the late 1640s, but interestingly, he includes leaders of the churches as well. So I think in a minute you'll figure out who some of those people might be. Tillinghast died suddenly in London in 1655, right after getting a meeting with Cromwell and absolutely berating him. And then he died. So he must have felt that was kind of, a good ending. But anyway, but his works, many of his works, survived in manuscript, and they were published posthumously. And if we look at these publications, we can see, we can kind of confirm the enduring ties that he had with his friends here in Mid-Suffolk. His Six Several Treatises, as it was called, was published in 1657 by John Manning and Samuel Peto. Peto was a congregational minister at Sudbury. The next year, 1658, Peto again, this time with both Manning brothers and Samuel Harbigham, all published 8 more of Tillinghast's sermons, which they claimed had been taken from manuscript notes that he had left behind. And the critical tone of Tillinghast's last sermons, I think, began to be matched by activism against the Cromwellian protectorate among the churches, the congregational churches in particular of Norfolk and Suffolk. So in late 1654, we find that 15 or 16 churches, this is one of the reports that we have surviving in the state papers, 15 or 16 churches in Norfolk were meeting, quote, to confer together and beg wisdom of the Lord, how we bear their witness for him against the present powers and their wickedness. So it's clearly a statement against the protectorate. We don't know which churches they were. This group considered either petitioning Cromwell or sending 30 representatives to London to express their dissatisfaction. They're in a sense dissatisfied that he had taken on the protectorate. If you think that monarchy had been providentially killed off, and then one man takes control of the government, even without the title of king, that was the real crux of the matter, I think, for them. So they aim a lot at Cromwell in particular once he becomes Lord Protector. By the end of the following year, 1655, so just after Tillinghast's death, government officials were getting concerned about growing Fifth Monarchy militancy in East Anglia. The Major General appointed by the Protectorate government to oversee this region, a guy named Ezekiel Haynes, organized, for instance, local militias in the area to write and sign off letters of support to Cromwell. And of course, many of these militias would have been made up by local Puritans. We know they were, and we have some of those lists, and they were indeed made up of some local Congregationalists who signed these lists. So there's a split going on here within the community. In December 1655, Haynes reports to Cromwell's spy master, a guy named John Thurlow, that he was aware of some endeavors to draw off the gathered churches in the regions away from their support of the government. And at the same time, a Norfolk minister, congregational minister, who was kind of up by Trunch, where Tillinghast was, wrote to Thurlow expressing the dilemma that local Congregationalists were facing with their Fifth Monarchist brethren. He confessed to Thurlow that these militant Fifth Monarchy men were Christian. Yet so I must acknowledge, they were Christian and godly, yet so I must acknowledge that the more ancient Christians about us are generally amazed to behold such undertakings among them that profess the humble way of Christ. There's an attack on that militantism by people they share fellowship with. This letter, I think, perhaps provides one of the potential keys to what's going on here. The Manning brothers, Harbigham, Samuel Peto, and a number of other Suffolk congregational ministers that I haven't mentioned but are on your sheet. Men like Thomas Taylor, who oversaw the Bury Church, Frederick Woodall, who was in Woodbridge, and John Stoneham, who were in Ipswich. All of these guys were educated in Cambridge in the late 1630s and early 1640s. They took up their first ministerial positions during the Civil Wars or just after, and they all worked closely together throughout the 1650s. The more ancient congregational ministers in the area, men like William Bridge, of Great Yarmouth and Thomas Allen of Norwich and many prominent laymen and women of their churches had a different experience. They were the ones who had experienced exile before the civil wars in Rotterdam. And it's those people that can continually be found trying to dampen down the millenarian expectations of this other group and the militant action that they were moving towards against the government. This conflict within the community came to a head in early 1656, when the Norwich Congregational Church sent letters to all of the surrounding churches in Norfolk and Suffolk, inviting everyone to a conference in Norwich concerning the visible reign of Christ and our duty towards the government of the world. The letter, which praised the fellowship of the saints, suggested it was best to get a sense of the issue through conference, through a gathering of churches. Attesting to the importance they placed on the meeting and its outcome, the Great Yarmouth Church, we have in its records, sent 9 messengers. They got nowhere near that for any other conference throughout this period. And it included their pastor and teacher, William Bridge and another minister, one of their ruling elders, who was a very wealthy merchant in Yarmouth, and 6 other of the most prominent members of their congregation. They really threw everyone at this as an indication of how important they thought it was. Thurlow, our spymaster, was duly informed about the meeting in a letter which emphasized the shame of the more sober and able men of these friends. And the author of this letter hoped that the meeting would vindicate the reputations of the churches and distinguish them from their more radical brethren. The result of the meeting, and almost certainly Manning and Harbingham and others were there, the result of the meeting are recorded in the Yarmouth Church Book, and it agreed that there would be in the latter days a glorious and visible kingdom of Christ wherein the saints should rule. But by general vote, so not unanimously I would presume, the messengers declared, quote, that it was our duty to give subjection to the present powers, and if any should do otherwise, it should be a matter of grief and great offense to them. So that's the leverage that you had that they were trying to wield. But their connections of this group also came through. The outcome of this conference was also reported in the state newspapers in London. So quickly sent down to London, no doubt through connections of these churches right to the top of the Protectorate. Though chastened, a disaffected minority of the congregational community continued to debate further action. 3 weeks after this meeting in Norwich, Haynes, our Major General in the area, uncovered a meeting attended by Stoneham, Harbingham, Woodall, Taylor, and a few other unnamed ministers, perhaps the Mannings, we don't know, all of which were seen to be disaffected messengers of churches from Norfolk and Suffolk. They planned to petition Cromwell to resign his protectorship, and in speaking to Stoneham, Harbingham, and Taylor, Haynes found all 3, quote, highly disaffected with the government and under great apprehensions of a sudden change. But they also professed to modestly present their grievances. So angry but not taking up arms. Haynes remained suspicious of their intent, but seems to have encouraged them to stay in contact and to communicate their grievances through him. Because in April, just a couple weeks later, Stoneham and Woodall invited Haynes to a meeting in Harleston, not far from here. And Haynes again used this opportunity to bring with him a number of, as he called it, persons eminent in the churches of these parts, and that included our Yarmouth minister, William Bridge. And he was clearly hoping that through this he might be willing or able to manage this situation. Now, the Manning brothers aren't mentioned in these sources, but their co-publication of Tillinghast's posthumous works and other activities that we do have of them seem to suggest that they are fellow followers of this Fifth Monarchy movement. And indeed, what we have is a particular group of younger ministers in this region of Suffolk who are deeply involved in opposition to the Protectorate in this area. Hames doesn't comment on the result of this second meeting, but is perhaps telling that there's no other evidence of opposition after this date from any of the Suffolk congregational churches. Norfolk continues, but we have no other evidence of opposition in Suffolk. And in fact, it appears that these ministers may have been placated in some ways and indeed brought into the government. For in 1657, Pedo, both Manning brothers, Harbergham, Stoneham, Taylor, and Woodall, all of the ministers that we can trace most actively pushing for the Fifth Monarchy movement here in Suffolk, were brought into the government's commission for Suffolk for examining parish ministers. So in a sense, they were given state positions within the Cromwellian Church. And it seems that we find no more, at least active radicalism from this group. Well, the Fifth Monarchy crisis in East Anglia fizzled out. And indeed, it was quickly overtaken, in fact, by the Cromwellian Protectorate's fall in 1659, and of course the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. They had a lot more to worry about, you might say, within a year of many of these conferences. Puritan nonconformity afterwards went underground again and experienced its second major period of persecution in the 17th century. And again, to my knowledge at least, we know very little about the Walpole congregation under this period of persecution between the restoration of the monarchy and that moment represented by the deed over here, in which they managed to procure this particular building just after the Act of Toleration in 1689. But I think this building's secluded and secretive nature speaks to the lingering fears of persecution and opposition that they must have endured during this period. And especially on a day like today, this sort of idyllic setting in the Suffolk countryside, a wonderful sort of calming, beautiful, intriguing, really, chapel, belies, I think, the radical edge of the original Walpole congregation. Emboldened, as they were, by the regicide of Charles I and the overthrow of British monarchies, Puritan, in and around Walpole, at least for a decade, managed to found a new denomination in this area, and then infused with millenarian expectations of the imminent return of Christ, threatened indeed to overthrow the Cromwellian Protectorate. This chapel suggests a hidden church in a farmhouse. What are we, a mile and a bit from Walpole, outside of the town, hidden from public view, even after religious toleration had been granted. But for the first decade of its existence, the congregation that eventually settled here was far from that. They were bold and controversial, and they engaged with some of the most radical ideas of the British Revolution. Thank you. I don't know where Millie is, but I'm happy to take some questions. Do you want to compare?
I'll do the question thing.
Okay.
So you'll have to sort of wave so we can see you.
We have
as
one
well.
behind you and then one over here.
Okay, let's start.
Yeah. Can I ask, do you have any information about who is funding the church? I mean, are these guys supposed to be living off stipends from being on the radical wing of the Church of England?
Yeah.
Who else is funding and allowing these churches to form?
It varies. Most of the people I've talked about, minus Thomas Taylor, had parish livings, so they had the ties, but they weren't much. We have a government survey, particularly of parishes overseen by congregational churches, from 1655, and in there Manning claims that he has, I think, about £25 per annum from the living at Cookley and maybe another 10 or 15 from Walpole. The expected salary of an educated minister in the 17th century is about £100 per annum, so he's well under that. And he's petitioning the government for an augmentation to his living, so basically the government to step in and fund where the local parish can't. A lot of these parishes in the 17th century were, of course, overseen by lay people who own the living and might collect the tithes and then decide on the salary of the minister. So there were real restrictions there, but some of them were funded through there. More urban churches, William Bridge in Great Yarmouth, he's funded by the city. He doesn't have a parish living, he's given a lectureship as it's called, but he's paid, I think, £100 a year just from that. So everything else beyond that, that's funding the minister. Everything else comes from the congregation. So for someone like Thomas Taylor in Bury St Edmunds who doesn't have a living, the church has to fund it. And they petition explicitly saying that their congregation is very poor. They only have about 6 people in the church that aren't on poor relief themselves. And they have to rent what's called the Shire House in Bury. I don't know if it's still there. Because the Presbyterians basically control the 2 parish churches in Bury, and they won't let them use it because they don't like it. Right? So it can be really hard for a church, because if the minister doesn't have some sort of state or parish funding, then the church has to support them. And if it's a small church in a rural setting, it can be very difficult. So there are lots of, this government survey is really interesting. There are a number of parishes around here, Southwold's one of them, that is listed as destitute. They don't have a minister. It's clear they don't have a minister because the tithes won't attract a minister, because they're not enough to live off of for the style of living that you would expect from an educated gentleman. Yeah.
Over here.
Anything to be said about the happy or unhappy relations between the new congregations and the established Anglicans?
Oh, loads. I don't know much about it in this area. For these little parishes around here that I've been talking about, other than to say that I did spend the other day down in the Ipswich Record Office looking at the registers, because I know the parish registers can often throw up lots of interesting things. There's signs of cooperation. Samuel Harbergham, who's in Salem, he obviously stays there after the Restoration, and you're not supposed to. There's a 5 Mile Act where that comes in, where ministers were not allowed to live within 5 miles of where nonconformist ministers were not allowed to live within 5 miles of the parish that they preached in. He's able to stay, probably because he's dying. But written into the parish registers is the words roughly Samuel Harbergham, pastor of the church in Salem. Now he's obviously kicked out of the living. There's another parish minister who has the cure. He's a nonconformist outside the church, but the relations must have been at least easy enough for them to, record his status really as a nonconformist minister in the parish registers, which I find amazing. That normally doesn't happen. You're usually kicked out of town. There's lots of evidence for bitter divisions. But interestingly, Wrentham is another church where they're able to use the parish church, the nonconformists are, the Congregationalists, I think until the 1670s, from what I'm able to see. There's an example of this in Norwich, where in St. George Tombland, if you know Norwich, the Congregationalists who took over that parish church in the 1650s, they're able to worship there into the 1670s because they have a lot of wealthy members who live in the parish, and they get themselves elected as church wardens, and they have the keys to the church, and they just come in at night and do it. So there's a real cacophony of examples of the relationship between the nonconformist communities and the sort of restored Anglican, if you will, communities. A lot of them are very bitter, but not all of them, which is perhaps the unexpected part.
Cubicle there, yes.
Yes, sorry. It's a very long time since I was an undergraduate and read Christopher Hill.
Yes.
I seem to recall that Hill presents Cromwell as very tender to religious radicalism, but actually socially very conservative in the way he thinks about behaviours and so forth.
Yeah.
And I suppose what you presented, that transition from Congregationalism to fifth monarchism is a transition, and I don't know whether you'd agree with this, from a kind of religious radicalism to a social and political radicalism, which must inevitably lead to the regime looking upon these people with a degree of suspicion.
Yeah.
And would it be right to think about them moving, as it were, from religious radicalism to social radicalism, or are these, as it were, the same thing, or two sides of the same coin?
I think they are linked. I mean, I think you can find plenty of socioeconomic ideas inherent within the Puritan movement long before the Civil Wars, but certainly at the start of the Civil Wars. There is definitely, and Hill wrote most excitingly about this, there's definitely a burst of activism around these issues from really in the aftermath of the First English Civil War, where you have this question of settlement. And it's that question of settlement that really throws most of these ideas up into the air, and we can see them more clearly. They were there before, but when you have a minority of people who have just won a war and are now in control, all of a sudden they want to talk about things in print and in meetings and so forth. So I think a lot of those radical social ideas emerge in that period most clearly after the First Civil War. And they gain speed after the regicide for a little while. Cromwell definitely, even in the late 1640s when this starts, I mean, he's well known for being one of the more conservative people at the Putney debates, for instance. But he also knows that these are the people who underpin the regime that is in itself based on a minority support in the nation. So he has to be very delicate about treating with these people. I think that he invites in John Tillinghast, the premier fifth monarchist who had been criticizing him, to have a meeting with him is entirely typical. We find this over and over and over again with Cromwell. He thinks he can persuade them. Send them to me. But he knows he needs to, right? And he'd been doing this as an army officer since the early 1640s because he'd been getting all these godly people, and of course none of them agreed about much of anything, certainly not the Bible. And so he develops that, I think, and I've written on this, I think he develops his notions of toleration out of that necessity in the army and then starts applying it to the nation at large once he becomes Lord Protector.
Another question? Yes, here? No.
I think you've demonstrated very clearly that in this area there was a lot of Puritan sympathy, and while the churches were Anglican, Church of England, that many of the clergy were very sympathetic, and there were groups within them. All of that changed with the Restoration and the Book of Common Prayer and the Act of Uniformity.
Yeah.
We had a service here to mark the 350th anniversary of the Act of Uniformity and the Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah.
I conducted a service where there was a bishop who preached at it, and in the course of his sermon he said he believed that the Church of England has never fully recovered from the loss of the 2,000 ministers who were ejected from their livings.
Yeah.
And therefore, non-conformity had to be built all again against that background. And that was certainly true of the congregation that there was here in Walpole.
Yeah. I think the legislation throughout the 1660s, which brought in the really the harshest period of persecution, against the brand new group of nonconformists, really solidified more than anything else the Protestant non-Anglican denominations in the country. They had 10 to 20 years of freedom to practice throughout the Civil Wars and interregnum, but it was and they had established these bonds, no doubt, as the people here in Walpole did, of having a style of fellowship as they wished. But then you throw on top of that, it's probably probably about 8 years really of really bad persecution, and that hardens the group. And many historians have probably echoed the bishop's sentiments in various ways of saying that that's the real calamity on forestalling any attempt or any possibility of bringing these people back into the Church of England through some sort of compromise. It's there that you really harden this idea that some people are permanently going to be outside the church, which was much more contested before the Civil Wars, and even during it.
The fifth monarchists, they believe that the saints be in charge,
Yeah.
basically. But they didn't know who were the saints. Somehow, if you
Yeah.
said you were a saint, you were
Yeah.
lacking some sort of humility, thinking you were one. I don't know if you ever were.
Yeah. People pointed that out.
I was wondering if they had a system where they thought that the premium rights was from, or somehow they would.
They use this notion of visible saints, visible sainthood. So, within the bounds of Christian charity, is this person likely to be of the elect? And from the 1590s, English Puritans, basically Elizabeth, you may all know all this, but Elizabeth has a massive clampdown on Presbyterian mobilization in the 1580s and 1590s. The Marprelate tracts are one of the great iconic moments of the late 1580s. And so what Puritans do is they shift for a while from mobilizing to try to effect the Reformation of the Church of England, and they often turn inward and they really focus on theology because they're allowed to print and publish, the ministers are at least, theology. And so they develop these sorts of practical divinity, is often called, experiential divinity, which systematizes Calvinist doctrine in really interesting new ways. And a huge part of that is about this question of how can you tell if you're one of the elect, if you're a saint, while also acknowledging that you can't. Can you likely predict? And so they worry about this, and they develop these really sophisticated systems for being able to tell, and that's all built into the Congregational movement. That's exactly what they used to create this sort of church form. So they were very comfortable in some ways by the 1650s with that dilemma. Some go so far as to get rid of that dilemma and say we can know, and the Spirit is within, and they get into a lot of trouble. But that's a different paper.
Question here to the side.
The persecution after the Restoration though wasn't equal across the board, was it? I seem to recall William Bridge has to flee to the Netherlands again.
Yeah.
But for example, the Mannings are still around in the 1680s, so somehow they must have been able to go with the flow.
Yeah.
And what was it actually then that was almost like, how do I put this? Were some of the dissenters dobbing in other dissenters for their own good, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's probably a little bit of that. I think it's more down to the local magistrate and the local community and how they want to treat this new group of nonconformists. People they've known, their neighbors, right? But if you had a magistrate who was fervently against them, then the magistrate has the power to arrest people, and they would. And so in some areas you get people sticking around. In other areas, what you often get after the 5 Mile Act is, and this happens, I don't know if it's the Manning brothers or certainly some of them like Thomas Taylor and Benjamin Stoneham, a few of them, they go up to Norfolk, and they just start ministering to the congregational churches.
Because they're not allowed to remain within 5 miles of their original parish.
But they can be up there, and they can administer and be pastors to those groups of congregational. So there's this switching. Bridge does that. He goes down to London. A lot of them go down to London. I think he's also in maybe Surrey or something. But they just trade off. Yeah. If they're not able to stay here, then there are other networks. A few of them go into trades. I think Thomas Taylor might sell tobacco for a while. A lot of them become physicians because they have an education, that sort of thing. But the most common route is for them to just trade around with other congregations.
And there's just one more thing, it's sort of slightly different subject, but there is some evidence at the beginning of the 18th century, when we've got the baptisms book for this chapel here, that there were people coming to Walpole from Brentford and being baptised here, but also there was the minister from here going to Brentford and baptising people there.
Yeah.
And I think Brown, in his History of Congregationalism, suggests that the Wrentham Chapel was so strict that basically, it was impossible to get baptised there.
Right.
Because how could you have become a member before you were baptised?
Yeah.
So does that suggest that Walpole was maybe more tolerant than some of the other places?
I mean, that would, at least for that period, yeah. I would read it that way. There are some interesting examples that I haven't really found in too many other sets of records from here, from the early Restoration. I think one of the Mannings may do this, but certainly Thomas Taylor does, or his church in Bury when the next minister comes in. But they baptize people godly people in neighboring parishes. That's very unusual. It's really tricky with congregational ecclesiology whether you should be doing that, but they do. So I think there are some members of the movement, particularly here, who may be receptive to that sort of laxity, promiscuity, they would say. But others will take a very strong line against that. So it varies. They have a clear theology of baptism, but when you're facing a godly person with a child and you have a strong idea about the necessity of baptism, it becomes an issue.
Certainly later in the 18th century, there is actually a very strong argument as to whether baptism itself, the rite, whether it should be done as a child or as adult. I don't think that necessarily affects here, but it does affect some congregational communities.
Yeah. Well, interesting fun fact, and again, this is a whole other paper which is going into my book. There are few, if any, Baptist churches in East Anglia prior to the Restoration. And the reason for that is all the Baptists are worshipping in the congregational churches, because your membership in a church is based on your perceived visible sainthood. It's not baptism in Calvinist theology isn't strictly necessary for salvation, so therefore it can't be a part of the determination about whether you're one of the saints and therefore eligible to be members. So in East Anglia, and this begins in Rotterdam, we think, I think, but Bridge and others spread that sort of view of a real open tolerance to adult baptism within the movement. And it's the only region in the country that really is lacking any Baptist church throughout the 1640s and 1650s.
There was a congregation in Framingham led by a man called Thomas Mills.
Yes.
And they worshipped until Mills died.
Yeah.
And after that, the congregation joined with the other dissenters, who at that time were both Congregationalists and Presbyterians in the same congregation.
Yeah.
And later, that congregation, or at least part of it, became Unitarian.
Yeah.
And some of those people who, in fact, were leaders of that faction, in fact, were families who previously had been Baptists.
Yeah, yeah. Framingham was, there's I think the Seventh-day Baptist movement gets started in Colchester. I haven't looked at that in ages, but I think there's a guy down there that he moves on to Northumbria, but I think he comes to Seventh-day Baptism and starts a church in like Colchester. So there's a couple, but when I've looked at the Baptist movement and where the churches are as a comparative, and there should be loads. Every other part of the country, they often sit side by side, and the East Anglia, they're just not there in the numbers that they should be. And I think that's because they're all congregationalists, basically.
Question from the upper level at all?
We haven't.
Oh, well, yes.
Well, women always allowed admission to the church to be able to take the sacrament?
Oh yes, definitely.
Always, from the 1600s?
Yeah. There was no bar on the sacrament, certainly not. The only real restrictions on women are, of course, taken from Paul. So we are. They don't really say entirely how. They don't tell us enough about women. They don't tell me enough about women, anyway. It's almost certain that, on the whole, they didn't get it. Even if they were full members, they couldn't vote. They could certainly take the sacrament and participate in other ways, but they wouldn't vote, we think. The few examples where we have of them indicating it's men only. And the few suggestions that women could vote all come from Presbyterians' opponents who are trying to slander the congregation. So I think probably women weren't allowed to govern, or possibly, well, they certainly weren't allowed to read or anything like that or preach. The Quakers are the ones who actually allowed, the only ones who really allowed that. But women could arguably be a lot more active in one of these churches than your normal parish church. A few of the churches, particularly Bridges Church in Great Yarmouth, they have the office of the widow, which is like a female version of the deacon, and really focused on physical well-being. So they would go around the congregation when need to tend to people who were unwell, that sort of thing, but on behalf of the church. There's a few examples we have where, for very specific circumstances, women are allowed to be messengers from a church, usually to other women. And the most interesting case is John Bunyan's church in Bedford, which you can argue with me on this if you want, but it's a congregational church, not a Baptist church. That church, when any woman comes